Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards is a bit of a gaming oddity to me. I actually remember renting this game several times from Blockbuster when I was a kid, but looking back at this game now, I actually can't remember too much about how this game actually played. But hey, there's gotta be some interest for this game considering a complete in-the-box copy of this game is actually one of the more expensive Nintendo 64 copies and was actually kind of hard for me to find. So I guess we should take a look at this game and see how it holds up all of these years later, and see if it actually lives up to the legacy that Kirby is known for. But of course, before we can jump right into this game, we have to take a look back at the game's development. Now, interestingly enough, HAL Laboratories, the developer of Kirby, was in a really unique place in the gaming market when development started. Development on this game started just before Kirby Dreamland 3 released on the Super Nintendo, but that game was an oddity in itself because the game actually was the final game released on the Super Nintendo in September of 1997, a whole year after the Nintendo 64's launch. And since that game released so late into the life cycle of the Super Nintendo, it kind of put the development for Kirby 64 quite a bit behind, meaning that this game wouldn't actually release onto the Nintendo 64 until later in the console's life cycle. And the game was originally intended to have a 3D type environment similar to Mario 64, with prototypes being made for this game that actually were pretty good, as according to project manager Takashi Saito. During this time, besides the gameplay parts of the game, they really focused on translating the same type of art style that was featured so prominently on the Super Nintendo and Game Boy versions of Kirby into a 3D landscape that would still make the game feel aesthetically pleasing the way that the older games had, while of course bringing Kirby to the next generation of consoles. And with the building blocks of the game mostly finished, they actually set up a prototype at Space World 1999 where they let children try out the game, and the team at HAL Laboratories actually decided that there was still some improvements that they could make because they felt like there were still some problems with kids not fully understanding the controls, and they wanted this game to be as accessible as the other Kirby games had been. So they went back to the drawing board. So after the convention, they went back to work on the game, and they actually changed the control layout, this time around utilizing the D-pad instead of the analog stick, which was common in most N64 games, and reworked a lot of the game to be a 2.5D style game, very similar to the Donkey Kong Country series on the Super Nintendo, which would not only utilize the Nintendo 64's graphical capabilities and be able to continue to show off the art style that they had been working on for a couple of years now, but also have a more classic gameplay style that was more linear and easily accessible for newer players. They even did another playtest with this new layout before the game's released with elementary school students, and apparently the game was received much better and players were able to pick up the game a lot easier. So feeling confident enough with this game and reworking all of the levels in the game saw an actual release in summer of 2000, and the game actually got really mixed reviews across the board. Some reviewers completely praised its gameplay and others kind of said it was mediocre, so we actually are going to have a lot of things we're going to have to think about as we go into this playthrough. So starting things off in this game, we jump right into the story, which is kind of vague and generic at the same time, which is an interesting combo. Essentially, on the planet Ripple Star, there's a bunch of peaceful fairies that protect this powerful crystal thing, and when this mysterious dark matter comes to try to get the power of the crystal, they break it or something, and then the shards are scattered across the galaxy to various different planets. With that, one of the fairies named Ribbon goes to planet Pop Star and meets Kirby, and they decide to team up to try to get all of the crystal shards back, because obviously Kirby has nothing else to do. And thus we begin our adventure on the planet Pop Star, which is the common Kirby homeworld planet. And honestly, the first level, and while we're at it, the entire first world is incredibly easy. I was actually surprised with how easy this first world is. Now, I've played a ton of different Nintendo 64 games made for various different audiences, and this one just felt so much easier, or almost a little too easy, where there felt like there wasn't too much of a challenge. Sure, I was still kind of getting a feel for the controls and figuring out how damage worked and whatnot, but I'll be honest, these first levels in the first world actually felt kind of boring just because it felt like a lot of very generic things that you've seen in tons of other video games before. However, there were a few perks that I kind of picked up on along the way. Being able to get the various power-ups from different enemies was really cool, and the fact that there's an abundance of boss fights was something that I really appreciated. It seemed like every level had its own boss fight, and at the end of the several levels in a single world, there's a larger boss fight, and that was really cool. Now, if you look at the front cover of the game, it shows off 5 different characters, and these are essentially Kirby's friends that you meet up with in the the first world, and they help you out on your adventure. Now, apparently these characters were actually originally planned to be playable characters that you would be able to switch between, but unfortunately this feature got cut for whatever reason, and so it is that Kirby is the main character that you play as. However, as you progress through the game, you will see these guys pop up every now and again to help you out, and there are times where you do get to do something different because the characters are around. For instance, there are a few sections in the game where you actually play as Kirby riding on King Dedede's back, and it's a little bit slower gameplay, but you have this big hammer, which is kind of cool. And mind you, I think King Dedede looks his absolute best in any video game in this single appearance alone. And occasionally Waddle Dee will show up and will let you do some sort of vehicle type level, whether you're on a minecart or some sort of boat. It's actually really fun. It's definitely drawing a ton of inspiration from the Donkey Kong Country minecart missions, but it actually makes it fun here, and it was a really good idea to include these parts because it breaks up the gameplay from being more of the same thing. Adeline is also a character who doesn't really do too much. Occasionally she will paint you a power-up or something like that, but otherwise she's pretty useless. She does make for an interesting boss fight in the first world though. After completion of the first world and fighting the boss that I mostly just remember as the tree from Super Smash Bros., we're off to the second world in this game called Rock Star. And honestly, this world was much better than the first world. At this point in the game, it seems like they assume that you kinda know what you're doing, so the difficulty is upped a little bit. There's some interesting challenges, enemies become a little bit more varied, and actually a lot of the main criticisms that I would have had from the first world are kind of alleviated here as the game begins to become a little bit more interesting. Plus, the aesthetics behind the world design is a lot more unique, and there's actually some really cool ideas in level design that are kind of an interesting take on the typical 2D side-scrolling platformer. This time around, the game feels alive when there's different types of things that are happening in front of you that you have to adapt to on the spot in your gameplay. Now, Kirby, still being very similar to how Kirby is in all of his other games, is mobile enough where he can jump around and fly and do his regular moves like sucking in enemies and killing enemies with air. Is that what he does there? I never was too sure. But man, is Kirby so slow in this game, or maybe all Kirby games, but specifically in this game, it just feels like he's constantly just taking his time or just waddling across the screen. This was probably one of the more frustrating things, if anything, coming from someone who's used to playing a game like Mario, where you have the freedom to move as quickly or as slowly as you want to. In Kirby, you don't really have that option. You're gonna go slow and you're gonna have to deal with it. Now, you can run a little bit if you double tap the walk button, but it still feels a little bit like a slog. Also, while we're talking about controls here, playing with the D-pad actually wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be. I really didn't like the fact that you can't use the analog stick as an option if you wanted to play that way. You're forced to use the D-pad on the Nintendo 64 controller, but by the time I was through the first couple of levels, I was pretty much used to it already. Aqua Star is the third planet in this game, and while I was completely dreading a water-based world, this one actually ended up not being nearly as bad as I thought, and I actually had a pretty good time on this one, considering the level is a good mix of challenge and strategy, with a really great level of attention to detail and level design. And while this is something that's been in the other worlds so far, I really started to notice that there's alternate pathways that can kind of get you extra bonuses along the way, and it just felt very satisfying to discover the alternate routes that you can go and sometimes get some sort of small reward out of it, whether it be a piece of food to heal you up or some stars that can eventually get you an extra life. It was around this point in the game where I really started to experiment with the different types of abilities in this game, and this was actually one thing I remembered from way back when I played the game when I rented it from Blockbuster, but playing around with the different types of abilities and being able to mix match all of the types of abilities to make a new type of ability was something I really enjoyed. There's 7 different types of special power-ups you can get. If you suck in different types of enemies, you can get their power-ups, and then you can also combine them with other types of power-ups to give you an extra ability. Essentially, there's 7 elements, and you can make up to 49 different combinations of power-ups for Kirby. This is really cool here, and it kind of alleviates me feeling like we're missing out because they cut those characters out of the game, because at least Kirby has a wide assortment of different things that he can use to attack enemies with. By the time we get to the next world, Neo Star, things are really starting to pick up in difficulty, and it's actually something that became challenging to play through, which was really cool. It really gives players a chance to get their footing in this game, no matter how bad you are or inexperienced you are early on, but then it still goes up to a difficulty that would be standard for any type of video game you would play back in the early 2000s. And Neo Star has this lava monster thing. I'm not really sure what it is, but it's lava and a monster. But of course, after you go onto any lava level, you have to go onto an ice level next, and Shiver Star is really interesting. I really like the fan theory that I've seen floating around that this planet is apparently Earth in a post-nuclear apocalyptic world where Earth entered a new ice age because of a nuclear war and all of the nuclear fallout that put humanity extinct. It's a pretty heartwarming theory. I mean, if you look at the planet, it definitely does resemble Earth a little bit, but who cares? It's a Christmassy-like level where there's snow and there's a ton of factories just like Earth. But who cares if humanity went extinct in the Kirby universe? At least we get to have a good time just killing more things as we go. Finally though, we get to move on to Ripple Star and defeat the dark matter once and for all. Of course, on the way through this level, there's some interesting level design that is very reminiscent to some of the levels you were on earlier in the game, and you kind of have to fight against pretty much every type of enemy, and kind of a really interesting legacy type level that shows you everything that this game had to offer and everything that you had seen on your journey. It was actually a really interesting gauntlet type level right before you get to the final boss. And the final boss is this thing. Yeah, honestly, I didn't know what this thing exactly was, but after a ton of trial and error and just dying a lot because I didn't know what I was doing, I realized that I had to attack it with the same type of attack that was being used against me at that moment. And once I kind of figured that out, I felt like there was at least some type of strategy to maybe winning against this fight. It's actually a pretty decent boss fight nonetheless, and I really liked the fact that they didn't really detail exactly what to do here. You kind of had to figure it out as you go along. Of course though, once you complete this world, we actually haven't saved the day yet unless we go back through and collect every single Crystal Shard. Now there's usually about 3 of them hidden in each level, and honestly I'm not too sure how I feel about a game that makes you 100% complete it to get to the actual final boss in the game. I mean, I guess I don't have a problem with it necessarily, but typically back in the N64 days, it felt like if you played through the main game one way, then maybe they'd give you a bonus for going back and 100%ing it. It just felt a little weird that you have to 100% the game to actually beat the story. And honestly, after playing through this game for several hours, I just didn't really have the motivation to go back through and play the whole game again, looking for every single Crystal Shard along the way just to get an extra boss fight out of it. I kind of was ready to be done with this game by the time I had gotten this far, and to say the least, I don't really know how that puts this game overall. The game is really short. It took maybe about 3.5 hours to see everything that's in this game, and I was pretty slow to say the least. But the gameplay itself isn't fun enough necessarily to warrant me wanting to do several playthroughs again to try to get every single collectible item, in this case the Crystal Shards, just to get that final boss fight. But if you're curious what the final boss looked like, it looks like this. So there you go. Oh, but don't you forget, this game actually has full multiplayer, which adds so many points to any game if you're a fan of N64. It's just minigames. Yeah, I was actually really disappointed here because I know later on the Kirby games are kind of known for its co-op playthroughs, and this game would have been really good for that. I think it could have worked really well here and not have been something that would be too tricky to do, but for whatever reason they decided to make the multiplayer just a minigame experience. And to make matters worse, there's only 3 minigames, so you're not really going to be having a blast with your friends. This definitely isn't the go-to N64 multiplayer game in my collection. Seriously, this was actually really disappointing. Why couldn't they do something like Pokemon Stadium did, where they had a lot of different mini games you could play, and at least those were fun? This is boring. Okay, let's look at the games real quick. There's a 100-yard hop where you have to jump 100 yards. There's bumper crop bump where you have to catch stuff in a basket. It's just like that weird Apple Bear arcade game from back in the day, except in Kirby and less fun. And then there's checkered board chase, and this one is probably the best of all of them because of how chaotic it is. It's kind of like Spleef from Minecraft meets some sort of deathmatch with respawning on. I'm not really sure how it works, but it's a little bit better than the rest, but it's not something I want to sit down and play for an entire evening. But ultimately, Kirby 64 is a game that did a lot of things right and a lot of things wrong at the same time. The first world of this game does not do the overall game any justice whatsoever, and if anything, it probably puts a really bad taste in a lot of players' mouths just because the game is extremely boring in the first world. Fortunately enough, the rest of the game is really immensely fun with great atmospheres, amazing music, and really good level design. The mechanics behind the game are great with the different items and power-ups you can get, and having a ton of boss fights makes things constantly feel like the stakes are heightened. But at the same same time, Kirby seems to be the worst part about the game himself because of how slow he is. And honestly, this was one of the things that just really made this game feel like it was more of a chore to play rather than a fun experience. But hey, if you're looking for a game to show your kids or your little cousin or something like that, this game might be a great game for a younger player to try out, or an experienced player to get their footing in a game. But there's probably a reason why this game isn't marked as a classic in the same way you would see Mario 64 or The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And this game is probably also responsible for the reason that they shifted Kirby in the future to a ton of different types of spin-off titles before eventually returning to the more classic formula. When Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards released, it just kind of was a little bit stale, and that's the best way to put the game here. It's not bad, it's not the greatest game ever. I would put it a little bit higher than average, but I do have to say Kirby does like to eat a lot of food, and that's something I can relate to.